So I'm going to sort of shift our thinking a little bit around the idea of healing and wholeness by bringing our awareness to some things and asking us to consider some things. The first thing I like to share, and this is something I'm going to put on a t-shirt someday, goes like this. The body is the mind before the mind is the mind. Now, I've had this conversation probably 1,000 times, and especially with people who are very top down when it comes to meditation, is if you can refine the mind, you can take care of everything else. And I would say that's reasonably true if your life has gone really well and maybe you were born 10,000 years ago or something. But for most modern people, when we say the body is the mind before the mind is the mind, we're asking ourselves to consider what the body is carrying around with what we might call implicit memory or embodied distress or other kinds of conditioned experience, and especially trauma. So I'm going to do a very quick thing that I sometimes do when I bring this up with people to kind of prove the point, if you will. And I'm going to start with a martial arts context, and I think most people are aware of been doing martial arts a long time who are here today. So this is going to sound like kind of a martial arts maybe tough thing, and I'm not in any way suggesting any of us needs to be tough or think of me as tough or anything. But if we were doing a martial arts drill, say this was a class and we were all in the same room and we're all doing this drill, and the drill was to try and make the other person flinch. Right, which is a really good tactical thing to do in any kind of violence, is make the other person go, because if you do that, you have about 0.2 of a second before their nervous system is going to be able to make another decision, right? So given that that's pretty much a measurable thing, like I won't do this right now because I don't want to freak anybody out, but sometimes when I have this conversation in a room full of people, I'll take my hands and just sort of randomly move around and then slam my hands on the table as hard as I can to make a big bang. And for some people, they basically jump out of their skin and they look at me and their faces are white and they're like, what did you do that for? And it's to say, notice that you're right now, like probably physically feeling colder than you were a minute ago. You're probably sweating a little bit. You might be really mad at me for scaring you. And you might have just, peed in your pants a little bit or whatever the, thing might have been. And that's just to help us recognize that your nervous system as an animal has some pretty preset ways of dealing with threat and being startled and dealing with things like that. And the point, more importantly, being it takes on average 0.2 of a second before a person has their adaptive capacity or their present kind of agility and stuff like that. So if I go back to this idea of the body being the mind before the mind is the mind, in the context of meditation, anyone who's walking around or sitting still or, maybe lying in a sensory deprivation tank, which definitely would be good for your meditation, and that person's central nervous system is loaded with a lot of distress, a lot of intensity from work, from childhood and things like that. We have to recognize that we have to calm down from like red alert to whatever yellow alert to hopefully whatever green alert might be, before you could say the person meditating is actually still calm and present instead of sitting in an agitated kind of twitching place. And that's one of the things we often ask people clinically is, do you often jump to loud noises? Because if a person's nervous system is already kind of on the verge of, at any moment, something could make us startle, that's obviously the first thing any of us would need to encounter and adapt to and perhaps heal in some ways before meditation would be a conscious awareness, observing conscious awareness instead of a person with their toenails on fire or something like that. So that's one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is what we call polyvagal or what's the technical term? It'll come back to me in a sec, but there's basically a term, neuroception, for the way we perceive what other people's intention is. Now, we often call that intuition, but it is a measurable thing. And we do that by watching a person's facial expressions, right? So if I change my facial expression, like the back of your brain is like, hey, wait a minute. This is a weird context, but I think it's something that shifts our way of seeing this a little bit too. And this is for all of the women in the room or on the call, is we all know the faces that people make, or say men make, when they're trying to get your attention or to try and let you know that they think you're cute in some way. And some people are very overt, and you could say a little bit creepy in the way that they let you know that, you know, they're trying to get your attention. Now, men and women do this to each other, so I'm not just picking sides here. I'm just, as a man, going to make a kind of badly flirty facial expression for a minute, really badly, by the way. So just make sure you're all aware I'm mocking something here. Right. So if I do some weird hi, I'm really awkward, but I think you're cute. Or something even worse, then I think most people would naturally, before they actually recognize anything about what's really going on, there's a part of our intuition that's built into our brain from childhood that says, you know, that's not really the most trusting interaction that I'm having. And that's actually why we have this ability to read facial expression, tone of voice, and body language about 1/10 of a second before we actually encounter the information that we're picking up from people, which is why we call it intuition. You can tell when a person's being creepy or flirty or perhaps lying or other things, just based on your capacity to notice what their body language, tone of voice, and face are telling you. So again, when we think of the body as the mind before the mind is the mind, 2/10 of a second before now, or ahead of now, if that's a thing. If you have a lot of startle kind of reflexes built in your body and you're very hypervigilant to threat, that will be that experience. If you're a person who grew up around a lot of tricky manipulation emotionally, or you've been in some pretty dysfunctional relationships in your life, which covers a lot of people, you're also going to be naturally, as a person, observing the world with a little bit of what you might call a side eye, or a little bit of, well, I don't, you know, implicitly trust this person. So again, if we imagine sitting in meditation and we're like, well, you know, people are full of crap, you know, or I'm usually the person who gets duped in some way, we're not in a deeply still restful place, because our nervous system is still carrying around the assumption that whatever is going to come into our experience might not be completely in our favor or authentic or honest. It might be a little bit tricky. And that's a very, very important thing. So I'll come back to that, you know, in just a moment, but I want to bring our awareness to the kind of the why I'm talking about this. So here's a fun question that you probably don't get asked very often. What is between the mind and its source? Or what is between your present experience of consciousness, and what's between that and experiencing the source of consciousness itself? Now, when I say words, the source of consciousness, the assumption is that there's an answer to that, and, you know, lots of people might have them. But the thing I'm speaking to is more that boundary between the mundane conditioned mind that we all have, and whatever it is that gives us the capacity, you know, to be conscious. And more importantly, what's made people want to meditate for the last 50,000 years or so, as an actual organized, consistent endeavor that human beings seem to be interested in doing. So what's between those two things? I'm not asking anyone to answer that right now. I'm just sort of hinting that, you know, that's an interesting little conundrum to be with, which is a big part of meditation. So when we think about that boundary between consciousness and its source, a thing that's also worth asking is, what does conditioning actually do to people? Right? We were all conditioned by our parents, by our siblings, by our friends, by our lovers, by going to school. And I'll come back to a few things about that. Our culture, our, I don't know, yeah, there's 1,000 examples, but when we think about that context of conditioning, and maybe even take it a step further, would be to ask, what does domestication do to conscious beings? And I was once working with a First Nations elder, and he had asked me if I'd ever noticed that human beings were the first species to domesticate itself in the history of life. You know, ants can kind of domesticate aphids, and so there is sort of a way animals can organize the animal world to their benefit. But humans are the first ones that will use punitive authority, threat of punishment, and things like that to actually maintain the kind of, you know, social environment that we live in. And this is not a conversation about politics and he said, she said about how to run the world. That's above my pay grade. My inquiry, though, is if some of us have experienced a lot of conditioning, that's going to change how we perceive the world and what our values are going to be, what success might be. For those of us who've experienced more punitive versions of that and might feel a little bit kind of that domestication thing, and we've all been through the pandemic, and that was a pretty domestication, not subtle period of time for most people in the sense of obey or else or pick a side and yell at your friends and all of that. And again, we're having a conversation about meditation. So what's it like to inquire into the nature of being when the person inquiring has some highly disordered kind of approaches to the nature of experience, the nature of reality, the nature of relationship itself? Because if you're going to commit any significant period of time to meditation, it's kind of like getting married to yourself in a way, 24/7 for the rest of time as far as your existence goes, because you really want an intimate encounter, awareness, acceptance, and almost immersive reunion with that person, that part of you, that marriage. So this brings us to this question, how we approach life, or how we're trained to approach life, is how we're going to approach our practice. I'm going to give you a kind of a strange example of that. So let's look at human history in the quickest possible way. And this is all pretty measurable, I think, but feel free to look it up.